Hello.
Hey, how we doing, Eric?
Hey, John.
Good to see you.
How you doing?
Oh, I'm good, man. What's
Are you
up?
in Austin?
What's
Are you in
happening?
Austin, Texas?
What's that?
Are you in Austin, Texas?
I am. What part of the world are you in?
I'm in Thessaloniki, Greece.
Nice. How are
Yeah.
things over there?
Well, I went out for a really nice long run today, and on my run, I could see that people were just out. Like there were clusters of kids running around, and I don't know. There's just kind of a joyous feeling in the air. I think people have come out to start to talk to each other, and
Yeah,
they missed it, and you can feel them feel the joy of reconnecting.
for
They're
sure.
cautiously reconnecting, but you can feel it. It's really nice.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing here in Austin as well is that, I've never seen more people out in my neighborhood, like walking their dogs out in the yard. People have the free time to do it, and so they're enjoying their outdoor experience a little bit more, getting a little
Yeah,
bit of a vitamin D power up. And, um, I think some people are being more cautious than others, but for the most part, there seems to be a, a strange kind of new connectivity, at least in my neighborhood, where people are waving and being friendly and excited to finally meet their neighbors. So it's been interesting.
and like as you saw that, what did you feel inside yourself?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I try to look for a silver lining in everything, and I think that the one huge benefit of this entire global shutdown is that it really is giving people the opportunity, if not forcing people into a place of self-reflection. And
Yeah,
self-reflection can be a beautiful thing or a terrifying thing, and usually it's the latter before it's the former.
yeah,
And so it's interesting to kind of map with people where they're at on that progression, because you can tell the people who have already done a lot of self-reflection, because the shelter at home policies really aren't affecting them that much.
yeah,
They're used to sitting in meditation and kind of being by themselves for a certain period of time each day anyway. And the people who are not familiar with that level of self-reflection are really having a hard time, but also um, it's couched this whole thing in a way where they're up to the challenge. Like I feel like people are like, you know what, we're gonna beat this thing, and if that means that I have to learn how to self-reflect, then I'm gonna do it. And so it's an interesting keyhole and avenue into an awakening experience, and it's not one that I would have predicted, but we all get our own entry point, and I think this is an interesting entry point for some people.
yeah. I can feel almost like we're all in the same movie together. You know, like everyone's used to their different days and kind of their asynchronous realities with each other, and then all of a sudden we're all in the same zombie movie or whatever the big plot point of a movie is. We're all experiencing it, and we're having all of our little character freakouts and
Right. Well, you know, I do think that we live in a choose your own adventure world, but our focus determines which adventure we're on. And this has created this weird event, like you're talking about, that gives us all a similar collective focus. And because of that, we're all having a more shared experience than maybe we ever have had before.
yeah, yeah. And it's funny to see. You hear people, I guess, argue about different subjects, but they can kind of be so much more diffracted. And to have them all, or it's like a Zoom meeting with too many people on it. you know,
Right.
it's like uh, the the for me keeping track of all of the viewpoints now. on a single subject, it's like, oh my goodness, it takes a lot of mind power to keep up with how far the conversation's gone if you just bow out of the conversation for a day or two.
Right. Well, it's the information is so conflicting and so wide and vast that to be able to consume it all is an impossibility. And in a weird way, that forces you into a place where you have to feel your feelings of uncertainty, because I think myself included, and many people that I know use
Yeah.
information as a tool to feel some level of safety and certainty, and it's incredibly uncomfortable to feel uncertain about something. And so that's why a lot of people are using their quarantine time and they are going down some nasty rabbit holes. And I've really been trying to take the opportunity to be like, oh, I get it. There's absolutely no way I'll ever know 100% what's going on. And the appropriate way for me to deal with that isn't to try to grasp for safety and certainty. It's to feel the uncertainty and find some kind of alignment and peace with that.
Yeah.
But it's a lot easier to say that than to do it.
When you say that, the metaphor that popped in my head was someone who is used to being on dry land, but suddenly discovers that they're in water, and that they're the way that they're moving with the water is different. It's a different, like to leap in uncertainty. Uncertainty is very fluid. It's like all the possible movements that could happen.
Yeah. Well, 100%. I mean, that's kind of what going with the flow is. It is being willing to pivot as things change and accept new data points as your anchors, and find a level of alignment with that new position.
Yeah. I imagine rock climbers would have a really great, their brains might be well tuned for this environment, because
right, because they're just hanging off of a cliff and sleeping in basically like a half-foot hammock.
Yeah, and when their whole world is that next move, like
right.
They're no longer worried about the last move. They're like, what is that next grasp? Let me just think about that.
Yeah. Even that might be a little bit too forward focused, because they're living with a goal in mind, right? Like they want to get somewhere, and that's fine when you're traversing something that you can see the top of. But when the thing you're traversing is infinite in nature, there is a level of doing it because it's fun to do, not because you're trying to get somewhere.
Yeah, maybe fun is where you're trying to get to.
Yeah.
Well,
if not fun, maybe interesting, or at least some level of acceptance.
Right. Well, I guess for me, like the things that I reach for, it's like, well, for me, it's a little bit what feels good of it, but it's noticing where life comes up in me like a spring.
Yeah.
And that's I tend to reach for those things, but sometimes reaching for the simple things, you end up having to reach for more complex structures sometimes.
Sure. Well, especially if you're reaching for something that's in your stretch zone, or somewhat out of your comfort zone, which I think ultimately when people learn how to consistently reach into their stretch zone, it's uncomfortable at first, but then ultimately much more satisfying than staying in your comfort zone. And so, if I hear what you're saying correctly, it's this idea that if you're going to go for some state of being that's bigger than the state of being that you currently have, there's going to be a reorganizing or a reacquainting with that new bigger state of being, and that looks like complexity at first until you become acquainted with it and aligned with it, and then it feels just as simple as the old place of comfort that you were in. And
Yeah.
then the up leveling is a new level of complexity, or unknowns, I guess, because really complexity is just us grappling with the unknown nature of something.
Hmm. So, like as we're reaching for the unknown, like, and I think this is maybe a good place. But by the way, can you hear there's a Greek party happening next door?
Yeah.
My,
Opa!
yeah, my partner's one of her long-term friends. One of my partner's long-term friends is having like a name day in Greece. You know,
Okay.
everybody gets a name day. Like all Georges celebrate a name day on the same day.
That's
All,
amazing.
yeah, right. All Christophs like have one day that they all have in common. Everyone's like, "Yay, it's Christoph Day!" So it's Georgia Day today.
Nice. I love that.
Yeah. So they're all on Zoom in the next room, like having a cocktail party and celebrating name day. One
That's
second. One second. I'm
amazing.
gonna close the door.
I love it.
It was supposed to happen an hour before, but this is Greece, so like it's like
Things happen when they happen.
totally, totally.
I'm into
So this kind of maybe leads into a conversation about intuition, because intuition is a little bit about what you reach for. It may be a perception that you're reaching for, but it's how we feel into our choices, how we
Sure.
feel into what we select. So, and we're talking about being in a realm where we don't have the structure so much. We're reaching for things in an untethered world. And so tell me a little bit about how you reach. Like when you're seeing a range of possibilities in front of you, a hall of doors, what are the things that help you reach for those doors or select those doors?
Yeah. Well, I think there's different levels of reaching, right? So, for me, I break reality down into kind of three modes of perceiving. And so I've got the physical cellular level, which is the base level. Then I've got this mental energetic level. And then
Yeah.
there's a spiritual soul emotional level. And so
Okay.
each of those levels probably has its own kind of reaching. So at the physical cellular level, the reaching is I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. It's more of a survival type technique, where at the mental energetic level, it's more of a psychological reaching. It's that craving for information and knowledge. And then
Yeah.
at the spiritual emotional level, which I'm currently experimenting with the idea that if there was a hierarchy of these levels, that the spiritual emotional would be the highest on the hierarchy, and that's more of a combination of all of those levels that happens more at the feeling based place. And so my hypothesis is that feeling is something that's happening more on a soul level that our physical and mental senses are picking up on, rather than the other way around. And so I really am doing my best to train my nervous system to feel for that soul understanding, which
Yeah.
is a lot different than the bodily desire or the mental craving or addiction type thing. And for a long time, I I've convinced myself that if something felt good, it must be an intuitive knowing that I was having, that was the direction that I should go. But a lot of times, if we get too addicted to things feeling good, we miss those stretch opportunities. And so instead of listening for what feels good, I've done as good a job as I know how to do to start listening for what feels important.
Yeah.
And that's kind of similar, but things that are important don't always feel good. but they still feel like the direction I should go. And so, you know, in the last 3 or 4 years, I've pivoted from I'm going to do what feels good to I'm going to do what feels important. And I think that that's what this is theoretical, of course, because how could I know? But in this model that I'm kind of creating for my own enjoyment, I think the move from the mental energetic into the spiritual emotional is that shift from desire addiction based striving towards more what's important,
Yeah.
you know, allowing or receiving maybe.
So how do you, that's a great, it's like taking the dial and just turning it one click to the right, you know, from, you know, it's just making enough choice, but across all the random interactions that you might have, if you were to select that one choice 1,000 million times, like where that would take the compass of your reality would be very interesting. So how long have you been on that concept?
I've been able to give language to it really for about 6 months, maybe a year, but in some way I've been grappling with what is this new kind of perception that I'm having for maybe 3 or 4 years. And you know, a big part of it is understanding that at that mental energetic level, we have all kinds of filters and biases. I mean, that's what cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance is where, you know, our reticular activating system is becoming biased by what we consistently give our attention to. And this has, in some circles, been mistaken for law of attraction, like reality is reorganizing itself. And I do believe that, or I'm at least experimenting with the idea that reality is an information-based reality that can render itself based on some of the input that I'm giving. But I think that there's a difference between reality re-rendering itself at the information level and my reticular activating system just focusing in on a certain kind of information. And cognitive bias for me historically has shown up most in things that are political in nature, because my entire life I was tuned to the politics that felt interesting and good for me, and then I made the other side wrong, and so I never consumed or put my focus on what the other side's perspective was. And in 2016, given the interesting political climate that we found ourselves in, I really was attempting to start that journey of looking into information that felt uncomfortable to me because I didn't agree with it. And what I found was that the more that I put my focus on information that felt uncomfortable, the more that I could actually resonate with that information. And then that put me in an interesting position because I could easily see how one could thrive in either, using either as the information source for and guidance for their life. And I think, I mean, in no way am I great at this yet, but it has skewed me more towards a kind of empathy for people who think differently than me. And I get the sense that that is a more useful way of being, and it has allowed me to go deeper with more people, and because of that I've continued to explore that realm of experiencing.
That's nice. I'm taking that in.
And you know, I think that that's a version maybe of what people teaching self-realization have been talking about for years, but I never heard it in a way where I got it. And you know, you can consume all of the information about all of these spiritual concepts as you want, but until you really have an experience of it, you can't really connect into it at a level that makes sense to you personally. And so for me, perhaps I'm having more of an experience of, not that I'm self-realized, but what self-realization could ultimately look like, which is this ability to hold multiple perspectives in one frame without my nervous system completely crumbling.
Yeah, right.
And so
And maybe
go ahead.
and in doing that, perhaps being the most pure form of transmission between those frames, you know, in reaching your circuit out into these multiple realities and feeling them and honoring them in their fullness, then suddenly you're transmitting like arm to arm, you know.
Yeah. Well, it definitely feels like that. I'm not sure if that's actually what's happening or not, but you know, I'm an entrepreneurial consultant. So my business is helping entrepreneurs connect into purpose and then make money by connecting into purpose. And one of the interesting byproducts of this level of empathy and being able to hold multiple perspectives is that it allows you to assess the marketplace better. You have a bigger picture of what's possible for you, your business, and your customers. And so you can more effectively fine tune your systems, processes, and messaging to whatever opportunities are in the marketplace. And you know, since I've taken on this perspective and shed some of the emotional garbage that I had around this concept that I was right, because I think that when, you know, I have a huge narcissistic ego, and so I'm always trying to feel through that and get to the being or entity or expression that I am underneath that ego. Before that ego had to be created to protect me from the world as I perceived it, there was something that was a little bit more pure. And when I can dissolve that facade, it actually gives me a higher resolution of perception. And that's incredibly powerful for anyone who is an entrepreneur. I mean, for anyone doing anything, but especially if you're an entrepreneur who is looking to create things that will fill a need in the marketplace, you have to have a kind of perception that we might call intuition, or that gut feeling. And for me, the way that you strengthen the muscle of intuition is by feeling through anything that feels uncomfortable, because the discomfort is showing you that you don't have as full a perspective or alignment as you could on the world as it actually is, perhaps. If that's not actually the way it is, in practice, it certainly operates as a mechanism that seems to prove beneficial.
So let's say, how do you recognize the feeling of importance? What are the signals that indicate this door is the important door? Versus, in contrast to maybe what you stated before, which was this feels good. Like what's the extra tickle? You know, like how do you differentiate between those two energies? Are they
Yeah.
frequently polarities? Are they, you know, do they line up sometimes?
Well, a good example that happened to me recently is that, you know, I've been a hardcore conspiracy theorist for maybe 20 years.
Me
And,
too. Me too.
and because of that, I've learned a level of discernment, because there's so much misinformation when you're constantly diving into that world. And so I learned a level of intellectual discernment in that world, but also it somewhat guided some of my worldview. And so I have massively been collecting precious metals and kind of waiting for a monetary reset, and really like tied in with this idea of Austrian economics, and that central banks are bad, and that at some point fiat currency is going to get out of control and the entire financial system is going to crumble, and then my precious metals are going to be worth a bunch of money when we reset back to some kind of a sound money standard. So because of that, that was massively filtering my worldview. So when all of this stimulus money started happening, I started to look into modern monetary theory, which is a newer theory of money. It's kind of Keynesian 2 or 3.0. And it's this idea that as money becomes more digital, there's more flexibility. And if we have a sovereign currency, as long as that currency is expanding and contracting with the production of the economy, we can kind of invent as much money as we want. So that went totally counter to everything that I had ever learned as an Austrian economics geek. But so when I would see these professors talking about modern monetary theory, it would make me furious because it went counter to what I thought I knew about money. Yeah. And yet there was something, even though I was so mad and I would like shut my computer, you know, there was something that was like, you need to keep tuning in. You need to open your computer back up. And so I really started to dive deeper into that. And I'm not saying that that is a form of monetary theory that is good, but I understand how that could work now. And it took me from someone who is basically rooting for doom and gloom, because in order for my financial theory to be proven right, the entire financial world had to crumble, to one where I was more open to an idea that would benefit more people. And that there might be some marriage of those two ideas that could manifest itself. And so now I'm more in a camp that's kind of couched on both sides. I can hold both of those perspectives and understand how both could be right, and how there could be a potential merging of those concepts in a way that would benefit way more people than just the preppers having their gold be worth $10,000 an ounce. And so that was an interesting experience, because it was,
you're well positioned for that reality should it happen.
Yes, exactly.
Which is part of, you know, when you kind of hold that things will merge, sometimes they merge like way over here. Or sometimes they merge way over, you know, like one side mostly wins, but they're still integrated a little bit, you know, or
right.
Or well, one model. Go ahead.
Being able to hold those multiple perspectives allows you to hedge against either perspective, right? So now I'm properly hedged, where if we go full modern monetary theory, I'll be okay. Yeah. And if we go full Austrian economics gold standard reset, I'll be okay. And if we end up somewhere in the middle, I'll be okay. And that, just as an insurance bet, is a more comfortable place to be. But if I hadn't allowed myself to fully understand what I was in resistance to, I wouldn't have been able to be so well hedged.
Yeah, I love that. Now, there's, you know, the thing that makes it, for me, since we're, you know, I was talking about intuition earlier, it's that how, you know, the mode of recognizing that opportunity. And in some ways, it's a very logical option, because you can see you could just see, I know I've been opposed to this thing. So if I'm just reading my own screenplay, I can see where the plot's pointing me at, right?
Yeah.
So that level is happening at the language processing way, or maybe just you observing your own behavior, you know? Wow, I really got steamed at that Facebook post someone posted yesterday. Wow, what was that? That really zapped me, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's almost like there's a kind of transmutational power that happens when we feel our feelings. And so there's a kind of alchemy that can happen if you're tuned in to where you feel discord. And a lot of people will try to mentally spin their way out of discord, which can be effective temporarily, but ultimately that emotional thing that triggered the discord in the first place is still there. And so I have attempted over the last few years, and I feel like I'm getting better and better at it, at identifying when there's discord, and instead of acting on the discord or trying to intellectually spin my way out of it, I sit with the discord and the feeling of it until it balances. And in that balancing it's like it transmutes back into a kind of potential, which then opens me up to a greater frequency or ability to perceive. And then that's when interesting ideas come in. And so there's a kind of knowing that comes from the discord. And that's the type of quote unquote knowing that revenge is born out of. It's like, I know this feeling is telling me that I'm going to go and make this right and I'm going to get justice. But that's not actual, at least from my vantage point, that's not intuition. That is a response to the feeling. And so you're not acting from a balanced position, where if you will allow yourself to sit through the anger and the rage that's there, anything that feels off kilter energetically, either to the positive or negative extreme, because you can have a kind of positive mania that develops that is just as harmful. Anybody's ever been on drugs, that's what's happening. You get into a physiological mania that feels great, but often leads to poor decisions. And so by learning to sit with any feeling that seems too charged in either direction and allowing it to transmute itself back to its natural neutral point, there is a kind of transmutational power in that I feel opens me up to the idea that is most perfectly tailored for the most benefit to the most people. And ultimately, that's what I'm looking for, is a kind of loving or empathetic action that will net the best result for all. And the best result doesn't always mean that everybody's going to feel good from it, but the best result could mean that my action triggers them into feeling the thing that they need to feel as well. And maybe the best result isn't, hey, we need to do the thing that makes everybody feel good, but rather, hey, we need to do the thing that allows everyone to have the experience of the emotional blockage that's preventing them from being the loving entity that they want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, I think that's what the true law of attraction is. In order to hack reality at the information code level, we need to feel into what reality is giving us, because the law of attraction can temporarily, if our desire exceeds our feeling, the law of attraction can temporarily mirror our desire. But as soon as that desire begins to diminish, the true feeling place of where we're at comes in, and that becomes the attractor point. And so at its base level, if I'm not doing all the positive thinking, mental work, journaling, you know, all of the techniques that you can do to ratchet up the desire, if I'm not doing all of that and I'm just naturally allowing myself to attract things, I believe that reality and the law of attraction is rendering itself in a way that it will trigger the emotional release that I need to have in order to become the most empathetic and loving person that I can be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, I guess that would be assuming that there's a built-in teaching intelligence in the framework that we're existing in.
Right, and maybe there's not, but I do think that you can convince yourself that there is one, and perhaps that's useful at some level of the game. And right now, you know, I think you're right. Like it may be that there is a level of experiencing that is void of that teaching mechanism. But just like some people need training wheels in order to learn how to ride a bike, maybe the teaching mechanism is a version of training wheels that helps put you in that space where you can actually have that unbiased experience of just existing. I'm not there yet.
Yeah, I appreciate how much you work your process out loud, and you can see how much of your process is actually already worked out, but I appreciate that you show your edge points too, you know, in your in
Yeah,
thinking out
well,
loud.
I think when I have a conversation with someone like you who's good at holding space for a conversation like this and ask interesting questions, it helps me articulate what my process actually is. And in the moment, there's a discovery that's happening for me where I'm like, oh, that is the thing that I do. And so, that ultimately that's what a great conversation is, right? Is like each person is discovering something about themselves and then building upon that new discovery. And so I
So,
you know
so
hopefully
I want
they
to bring up. Oh, go ahead. So
I
I
would
want to
say
bring up something after that.
hopefully they're um right now the experience that I like having is an evolutionary experience, so feeling like I'm expanding and feeling
Yeah,
like I'm growing. Maybe at some point I won't be so addicted to that growth,
yeah.
but right now that feels like the space that I'm in, and so that's the lens through which I'm interpreting reality.
I feel for me like the way you describe it's important, like that there are different flavors of energy that we reach towards, and important is there's a kind of taste to it energetically, and
Mm,
there's also the past stored memory that we learn through these little snapshots of our past selves
yeah,
of, oh, that's how it turned out. I chose that and that's what happened. That was pretty cool. That was a little different than I've been getting. And
yeah,
at some point we get tired of some flavor. Like I love happy. I love happy. It's such a
oh yeah,
wonderful flavor. And sometimes I there's a there's you want a little bit of spice, or you want the recipe calls for other tastes and ingredients. You know that actually makes happy at a whole nother level, when it's seasoned with purpose, or when it's seasoned with um meaning, or even like loving sacrifice, or selflessness sometimes. That's a really wonderful seasoning. And for me, I think it's a little bit about remapping pleasure, because as you become more attuned to the different energetic frequencies of your choice, then you start to expand your idea of what actually does feel good. Like
right.
I've had a couple of moments where I've been taking on the experiment of choosing with my feelings probably since 2008, I guess. So it's maybe like 12 years. Um, and just doing that alone will enter you into a classroom, you know, because you become your own scientist. You're like, well, okay, let's try this. And oh, that was a weird choice, but it felt a certain way, and let's see what happens. And
Yeah,
after a while, you calibrate and calibrate and calibrate and calibrate, and that you will notice that sometimes like for me, like excitement or reaching would become the new
yeah,
pleasure. It might. One of the moments that really brought this forward to me was I was standing at the top of a waterfall, beautiful waterfall in Washington, and idyllic, just like maybe like a 30-foot drop, and beautiful place where the shelf had broken, and there's all these kids jumping off the waterfall, and I'm like, I have to jump off that waterfall. This waterfall is so beautiful, and there's so many people surviving it. Like I just have to go try this. Like how could I leave this memory? How could I leave this movie not being the hero jumping off the waterfall? And so I worked my way around and went to the top of the waterfall and stood at the top of the waterfall. And my body said, Eric, fuck no. What the fuck are you doing right now? Don't even think about it. There's nothing in me, like the cellular being. It's like
yeah,
there's nothing in me that wants to go off that waterfall.
yeah,
But and I could feel it, like by feeling my choices. That was a moment where, I usually feel them very somatically, and my body somatically was like, no. But it
yeah,
was the idea, it was the vision, maybe like my visual pleasure of the movie I had in my mind of going off the waterfall. And it was almost a logical understanding, or maybe like a past understanding, that of memory of times that I had gone past what I thought was going to feel okay, and it turned out really well. And I constructed that leap. And I'm so glad I jumped off that waterfall. You know, it was amazing, and I wanted to go off again. You know, and it opened the door for me jumping off many waterfalls. Now,
Yeah.
if on my epitaph it says Eric Nielson died of jumping off a waterfall, you know, 10 years from now, maybe my intuition was right. But
Right. Well, what a way to go.
yeah.
You know,
And
I think that there's two ways of approaching that for me. One is feel the fear and do it anyway. And the other is feel the fear until it's not there anymore and then do it.
yeah,
And those are both totally appropriate ways to do it. And
yeah,
um, it is one of those things where sometimes it sounds like if I'm hearing that experience correctly, it sounds like your desire to live that experience exceeded the somatic reality of the experience. And so anytime desire is ratcheted up above present reality circumstances, desire opens up a portal for you to shift. And to
yeah,
me, it sounds like your desire to have that experience was strong enough that it opened up a portal that you literally jumped into. And then that put you into this interesting new space where somatically you were able to map it differently because it felt amazing, I'm sure. And then that somatic memory is now there for you to reference. And so the next time the fear is somewhat diminished because of that transmutational thing where fear, when felt, transmutes into a kind of potential.
yeah. It was, you know, it was one of those things. I've jumped off 3 times now. It's one of the reason these moments stand out to me is because it was a moment where my way of choosing flipped upside down. Like I usually choose from a complex a complex series of feelings that manifest somatically, but are probably sensing on multiple levels. And it was one of the first times I had to use almost like this strong, non-feeling, assertive voice that said, "You're going to jump in." In fact, I think I said, "You're going to jump at the count of 3." And it was like, oh, it was like, okay, 1, 2, and I'm like, I have to do it. Like that was that assertion. I don't know if that came from ego. I'm not really sure where the assertion came from, you know,
Yeah.
but it drove the day, and it was almost like an unfeeling thing. It's like it was one of the few times I've ever turned my felt sense down and almost switched frames. Like
Yeah.
switched frames. I'm usually so anchored in my body. It actually caused me to flip into a very mental state, you know, to almost like short circuit, you know, what I was feeling in the body. And that's something I would rarely ever recommend anyone to do, you know, to just sort of short circuit out of that sense. But in that moment, it was and it shocked me because I had been living my life the other way for several years at that point.
Yeah.
And I was presented with myself like, oh, okay, this is what's possible when I choose differently. And it kind of made me go, well, maybe there's something to choosing this path too. And I've encountered a lot of willpower-esque people over the years. One of my friends would always say, just supersede, supersede. And I was like, supersede what? And he's like, supersede your feelings. And I just wanted to say no. But it was something that actually was like in the interest of being more flexible and stretching open the different ways that your mind can work. It was maybe a different way to choose.
Yeah. Well, as you're talking that, what it inspires in me is, in this framework that I'm describing, where there's the physical cellular, the mental energetic, and the spiritual emotional. Um, at different points in my life, I've been totally focused in one of those realms. And now
Yeah.
I'm pretty heavily focused in the emotional spiritual, but I'm starting to have an awareness that, oh, the true magic happens when these three levels are fully integrated.
Yeah.
And it's not that one is right and the other is wrong. It's that there's a perfect integration that can happen that is a mixture of all of those things working in tandem. And it sounds like maybe you are having an experience of two of those levels, or maybe three of those levels working in tandem. And I don't know if you've ever read the Carlos Castaneda book where the shaman jumps off the waterfall and does this backflip and lands on a stone in the middle of the waterfall and then dives in. But to me, that's like a visual representation of when that integration is fully locked in, you can jump off the waterfall, do a backflip, land on a tiny stone perfectly in the middle of the waterfall, do another backflip, and then end up in the water.
Oh, I love that idea. Oh, I haven't read, which book is that, by the way?
I can't remember what title it is. I'll send it to you and post in the comments. But I just remember in that book, it was when the shaman was describing the energetic structure that he sees, and it was these tentacles coming out of his solar plexus. And when he was standing at the top of the waterfall, these tentacles went out and basically scanned the terrain and attached themselves to the path that he was going to take. And then he melded into that and then just allowed it to happen as if it was a natural thing.
Yeah. I've had some experiences like that have felt that mergy feeling, where you say that, and I'm suddenly having some flashbacks, that feeling of touching every particle in the room, of flattening out to that level that you just become part of the frame.
Right. Well, that's why now is being called flow state, and there's a lot of universities are studying it, and they're studying all the Red Bull athletes and like looking at what happens when somebody jumps from space or out of a helicopter. And I do think that extreme athletes are an interesting specimen of what happens when those states merge, because they report back this godlike spiritual experience where they're jumping out of the helicopter onto the mountain with skis on, and everything is slowed down, and every second is 100 seconds, and everything is expanded so that they can perfectly navigate the terrain. And that I think is the expanded level of perception that's available to anyone when you find that perfect meld of being. And for me, I find flow states like that, not totally like that, but my own version, and in the place that I'm at right now, flow states, by feeling the feelings. Before you jump out of the airplane, you feel the fear of it until you get back to that baseline point. And at the physical cellular level, you can use things like breath work, Wim Hof method, box breathing. Like, these are all physical tools that can be used to sync up the mental, energetic, and spiritual levels. And so it's one of those interesting things where you can have a bottom-up approach where you're approaching it from the level of diet, exercise, breath work, and then having that open up the other levels. Or I think you can have a top-down approach where you're going totally the Zen master. I'm going to get rid of all of my attachments, all the energy bonds that I have, and then that opens up the desires at the mental and physical level, where you're not even craving an Oreo cookie. You don't want to smoke a cigarette, because the emotional construct that you've developed for yourself doesn't even have that as part of its framework.
Doesn't have the crave or the
doesn't have the crave or the aberration that would say poison is beneficial.
Oh, you mean like relating those things that you might be addicted to as poison?
Right, or maybe it's beyond that level. Maybe it's like you hear the stories of the Eastern guru who eats the LSD and
Oh
it
yeah,
doesn't seem to affect them at all. And so maybe it's a transcendence of even operating at that level where the body is labeling things good or bad.
yeah. There's also been some Zen masters and gurus that were notorious drunks, and
Right.
like
Yeah,
were
like
opium
that,
addicts.
the one that in order to see him, you had to bring him 2 bottles of vodka.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whatever kind of experience you want to have and unpack, you can have, and there's probably a level of mastery for every type of living where you can get so good at a certain kind of living that you actually transcend any negative effects of it. It's why you watch it. Maybe it's why you watch these documentaries of like super centenarians, these people who have lived over 110 years old, and they ask, well, what's the secret, Marge? And she's like, at 3 p.m. every day, I have a shot of tequila and a cigarette. And
Yeah.
it's like they're so in alignment with their behavior that
Yeah.
they've just transcended any aberrative effect that it might have on them.
Yeah. I've been living in Greece, and for the most part, the population has no inner conflict. For the most part, was just smoking and drinking.
Yeah.
It's like everyone smokes, and but there's no like, ooh, I'm smoking. It's like, well, of course, this is how you gesture. It's
Yeah.
part of the conversation.
Well, and there's a beauty to that.
Yeah.
I think that so I don't I'm sober now, but I was an alcoholic most of my life, and so there's an interesting experience where you're going from that lifestyle to a sober lifestyle where if you don't do it right, you'll end up miserable forever. And they call that white-knuckling your sobriety. And so the way that I've found comfort in my sobriety is by really getting back in touch with what those substances were removing me from, because I had an emotional addiction to avoiding uncomfortable feelings, and then I used the drugs and alcohol as an avoidance mechanism. And so when I stopped drinking and doing drugs, I still was trying to avoid those things. And because I wasn't feeling the discomfort and transcending it, I was white-knuckling my sobriety. And it wasn't until I stopped avoiding those things and actually allowed myself to experience them, transmute them, and let them pass, that now I'm having a beautiful experience of sobriety. But the reason that I say that is if I had been drinking and doing drugs, and I'm just hypothesizing, I don't actually believe this, but let's just do it as a thought experience or experiment. If I had been drinking and doing drugs not as an avoidance strategy, but just as an enhancement strategy, maybe it wouldn't have been such an issue for me. Because really the emotional addiction is the addiction that is most damaging, not necessarily the physical one.
I relate to I relate to most substances as an herbalist,
Yeah.
because I'm so used to so many different things having some effect on me.
Yeah.
Like I took a little ginseng today to kind of make my mind a little clearer.
Yeah.
I I bought some rosebuds because I wanted to just sort of soften the heart space in the house and just like have some of that rosy energy.
Yeah.
And so for me, on some level, drugs sit in little glass jars, and alcohol sits as one of many glass jars, that's just on the counter.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of sort of what it does to me, how I feel the next day, what would be the right moment to deploy it. And then sometimes some of those substances I've also related to, or they haven't always been in that range. Like I've also related to a sort of habitual pulling for something that doesn't feel like, as you take account of the whole cycle of it, doesn't feel in alignment. Like I've felt that before. And I've also had spirit slap something out of my hand,
Yeah.
just like you know, with a 2x4, you know, taking something that's really going to be dangerous for me. It's just like, bam, you know, like I'm going to teach you this once, you know, and I've had that kind of a lesson too. You know, it was almost like the way my grandfather would just like, ugh.
Well, yeah, I mean, back to your metaphor of it being, you know, like this recipe that you're concocting, and you can add these different flavors based on the experience that you want to have. And, you know, for me, drugs are, you know, I would never judge somebody for doing drugs, but I would ask that they make sure they understand the intention that they have for doing them, because there's a huge difference in doing drugs intentionally and doing them unconsciously. And I think that any substance can be a teacher, right? And if you go in with the intention that this thing that I'm about to take is going to be a teacher, then you can learn that lesson. And just like we were talking about the training wheels earlier, you can start to put the wheels in motion. And then at some point, if you really want to step into mastery, you have to take the training wheels off, because maybe those substances are just training you into a level of feeling subtle energies that you needed someone to amplify so much that you even knew they were there. And then now that your body has had an experience of those subtle frequencies at this massively amplified level, you're more able to tune into it at the level that it was maybe naturally designed to be received at. And so as a transitionary teacher and tool, I think that it can be an interesting way to go about it. I don't think you need drugs. I think there are natural ways that you can have that same experience without them, but perhaps that is an accelerator, or for certain types of people, they're just never going to move into that experience unless they have a powerful catalyst that transports them there. You know, and in that way, I think that drugs also, you know, help us tune our frequency. And our frequency is just like when we're tuning into a radio station. You know, there's one channel at 93.3 and there's one channel at 103.5. And depending on what type of an experience I want to have, I can tune into either of those channels, or I might be in between channels and getting more static. And so I'm trying to tune towards some place of better clarity. And perhaps those substances can help me tune towards that. And then once I recognize, oh, that's the channel I like, I'm more capable of consistently tuning towards it. But I see a lot of people who get addicted to the plant medicine journey, and rather than moving into how do I connect here naturally, it just becomes a habitual thing that they do forever. And that might be totally appropriate. Like if that's the experience people want to have, then people should have whatever experience they want. But for me, I recognized that I was addicted to the ease of getting into that space because I didn't want to do the heavy lifting of figuring out how to get there without those things. And now I'm not always able to get into some kind of transcendental space like that on my own, but sometimes I feel like I'm getting closer and closer, and enough to the point where I'm encouraged that what I'm doing is pointing in the right direction and giving me the type of interesting experience that I'd like to have, and potentially open me up to radio stations that you can't get to except on this natural journey. And there's plenty of people that are acting as psychonauts who are mapping these radio stations that you can get to with DMT and psilocybin and licking a toad and all of these different things. So you know, maybe it's all appropriate, but I'm seeing an opportunity where there's less people that are exploring this radio station that maybe isn't as easy to get to or as fun to get to, but perhaps because it's less explored, there's something that's more tantalizing about it for me. And so that's why I'm interested in having the more natural experience right now.
Yeah, sometimes when people smoke pot every day, I say, you should try this amazing drug called a sober day. You're gonna have such a trip, you know,
Yeah,
because it's a really different kind of a day, you know. There are things you
right.
see on that day.
And I think it's not just drugs. Like, I think a lot of people use their spiritual practice the way that they use a drug. They're using it to energetically puff out of body, not have to experience their feelings. The breath place puts them in this kind of transcendent, or breath work or meditation or yoga puts them in a kind of transcendental space. And that can be a appropriate way to integrate and to better meld with the present moment. And it can also be a form of escapism. And so one of the things that I started doing for myself, and that I suggest to people who have very heavy spiritual practices, like people who are doing like 2 to 3 hours a day, and they feel like if they don't do that, their day is not going to go right.
Yeah.
Like that's an addiction to your spiritual practice, because you can get to a level of presence where you actually don't require any spiritual practice because your whole life is a walking meditation. And so
He's got a heavy meditation problem.
there's worse problems to have, but a heavy meditation problem could be from the same root emotional addiction that someone else develops a heavy smoking problem. Yeah. And so ultimately the root cause is the same, and dealing with that root cause is what I'm interested in. One, is there a root emotional cause? And two, if there is, can I heal on that level so that there's no compulsion in my life and everything is coming from a balanced place of choice, rather than feeling compelled to move into some action?
I think that there's some, I can't remember if it was Piaget, how he described that oftentimes we don't reach for scissors. We don't reach for metal cutting. We don't reach for metal objects. We reach for cutting things. You know, like we mentally map the meaning that thing I'm reaching for cuts. And we experience that before we experience the metal, the plastic, and maybe what the thing really is materially. And that in a similar way, you might reach for the meaning, reach for a spiritual practice as an escapism, like that meaning is mapped in there. Like you said, the meaning, if I don't do this, I'm going to have a bad day. That's like a really strong, that's like we have to disarm the time bomb every day or else we'll all explode,
Right. Well, and this is what makes for effective copywriting and marketing, right? Because you're speaking to that primal level of being where if you really want to sell a product, you don't describe the product, you describe the benefit of the product. You describe the problem that the product solves. And, what you're describing is the problem that they're having with creating, a general artificial intelligence that can move about. It is that you can't tell a computer what something is. You have to let it come to an experience of what that thing is used for, and that's a much more conceptual thing to teach a linear machine. And I'm not going to speak about it like I'm an expert. I don't know much about it, but I know that is one of the issues that they've had, is that you can't just tell something to pick up the apple. In the context of general intelligence, there's a whole backstory that comes along with why one would even grab that thing.
Oh yeah, okay.
And as a marketer, my coaching practice is about allowing someone to properly tune their nervous system and tap into an innate wisdom that expands their perception and allows them to be a better business owner.
Yeah.
And so a big part of that is being able to message yourself in the right way that will resonate. And what you're doing, like I mentioned, is you are finding a place of empathy for your customer and then speaking from that place of empathy. And if you're someone who can't tune in to the subtleties of feeling an empathic connection with another being, you're probably not going to be a good marketer. And so the work that I do is helping people tune to that subtle level of emotional energy that is available, which then allows them to make business decisions that reflect that new subtle awareness. And ultimately they can see problems in their infinitesimal stages before they balloon into something that's unmanageable. And the same
Yeah.
for opportunities. You can spot an opportunity before it's even budded out of the seed. And because of that, you can be first to market on that opportunity. And to me, that's the practical commercial value of tapping into this innate inner wisdom.
Yeah, I love spiritual pursuit as a business case.
Yeah.
Because it is the marriage of different worlds. It's like this has real material world benefit, and it feels great too. It's like it activates your whole being.
Right. Well, and ultimately, if you're the type of person who views themselves as a creator, and many
Yeah.
entrepreneurs are in business because they like to create things, and so
Yeah.
ultimately the identity that you're creating for yourself is one of being the visionary, right? And so a visionary is someone who is able to have this interesting melding of imagination and wisdom and then practically apply that in the world. And historically, we've seen visionaries as people who were just born as visionaries. And certainly that happens, but I do think that visionary, imagineering, wisdom, these are all things that we can train towards when we properly figure out where our edges are and how to feel through those edges, and then how to properly integrate these three levels that I've been speaking of, the physical, cellular, mental, energetic, and spiritual, emotional. And that melding of those layers
I want to add one
opens up
in.
the perception. Yeah.
I want to add one in. Every time you say that, I'm like, I want to add this in. I
Yeah.
think it's part of the cellular level, but
Okay.
it's something I'm really becoming. It's been highlighted because I've been watching The Walking Dead.
Okay.
I decided if we're gonna have a pandemic, I'm gonna watch a zombie movie.
Yeah.
Zombie the whole time, just to get me in the mood.
Yeah.
So, and what the show highlights is, as society falls away, people regress in some ways to a more primitive way of living, and the instincts
Yeah.
of taking care of territory and fighting things. And, people aren't just planners; they're suddenly fighters. They're suddenly having to deal with things like security and danger, and it really speaks to what it took for us to get to this point as humanity. We're like 100,000 years in the story, and we're 3 or 4 million years in the story of life and cellular life. And at the cellular level, there is this transmission that's going on. It's like the long drive, hard drive of memory that's possibly stored cellularly, like local copies. It's possibly also stored energetically, like, so many spiritual practices have a huge component of honoring the ancestors
Yeah.
as a information source, and even things like neurolinguistic programming and family constellation therapy really link in, like what happens when you link in these ancestors and kind of plug them into your consciousness or your operating system. And I think that's like a level. I think maybe that's cellular, but it could be multi-level, and I feel that that's also speaking. Sometimes I have a hard time when I'm thinking about intuition. It's like, okay, is it a little bit of that speaking in as well? These old strings of wisdom that aren't just how to survive in a 100-year standpoint, they're how to survive in 1,000-year standpoint, they're how to survive 10,000-year standpoint. Like they're these long chains of information,
Yeah,
and I feel like they're in there too somehow, speaking in my
yeah.
intuition.
I would call that like an emotional inheritance, you know. So there's a kind of mapping that happens at each of those levels, you know, at a societal level and at the individual personal level. And you know, as we're seeing with the study of epigenetics, we're basically a sponge for the way that society is mapped at during the time that we're having our experience. And so we're absorbing energetically the societal mapping around us, and then interpreting that in a way that then becomes our personal bias, basically. And you know, one of the things that I think is interesting right now is that we're all developing a level of subtle awareness where, you know, things, the instinctual survival mechanism that is in all of us, because life is very easy, even in a pandemic, like comparatively, you know,
Oh yeah.
to living in the jungles, life is incredibly easy, and so because of that, you know, maybe the center point of being, rather than living down in that physical cellular level, has bubbled up into these other levels, and so the dictation of the experience, rather than being at the guttural primal level, even though there's some residue of that
Yeah.
is still there, but the locus point, or the focal point, maybe lives in some of these other levels. But you know, I do think that the birthing process is not just a physical process, right? Like you're talking about these like soul communities and these kind of extrasensory levels of reality and perception that are available to us. Like all of that in concert is
Mm-hmm.
is melding together in the womb, right? And then that becomes the portal into this physical experience. But just because we're having a physical experience doesn't mean that we don't have tentacles into those other worlds that are giving us subtle information. And
Yes.
so perhaps what our intuition is our becoming more attuned to what those subtle influences are, and allowing those to have more prevalence in our decision space.
Yeah. I appreciate Abraham-Hicks often talks about um, sh- they will describe things as expanded perspective. You know, like when you become more of yourself. And I think that maps really well to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I was an Abrahamster for 15 years.
Yeah.
I love Abraham-Hicks. You know, where I parted ways with the Abraham-Hicks work
Yeah.
was that it's a very mental practice, right? And it's very easy for people in that world to get addicted to the mental processes and avoid the uncomfortable feelings. And Abraham themselves has talked about, you don't need to feel through your past. You don't need to feel through your trauma. And I agree that you don't need to. You can have an experience where, if you're working those processes every day, and for 15 years I had an experience of working those processes every day. I was the guy doing the 2 hours of spiritual practice every single morning in order to manifest the perfect day, and it worked. You know, that work does work. However, when you stop doing those practices, the experience slowly starts to devolve, because the true state of your presence comes online. And so for me, I was more interested in how can I just be myself and still have an amazing day rather than constantly having to ratchet up, my experience on this mental side in order to create what I wanted. And of course,
Right.
there's a melding of that. Like I still use my mind to create the things that I want, but I'm also integrating, maybe what historically has been called the shadow work, like feeling through some of my demons, literal and figuratively, so that I can become a better integrated human. I'd be
Yeah.
curious to hear your take on the Abraham-Hicks work as it relates to shadow style work.
Um, well, I think that Abraham-Hicks, in some ways, her teaching kind of melds with a lot of other teachers, so they have become my own creation in some ways. Like trying to remember exactly what she said um, is difficult because I've mixed it up in my own head.
Yeah.
I made it work more for me. For me, I feel I've taken what she said and moved almost from a felt sense outwards, but feeling at, like, I've heard her describe feelings as a reference to what's happening energetically,
Yes.
and so for me, I built an energetic topography of my life where I could at least feel where the shadows are and feel where the easy paths are and be able to discern if I was going to have a day where I wanted to tackle my shadow or if I wanted to have an easy ride,
Yeah.
you know? And because not every day is a shadow tackling day, although maybe more days should be. Or like in general, I will try to take a risk every day. In general, I will try to look at what's there. But
Yeah.
sometimes I don't have the energy. Some days you just want to feel good.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, one of the things, because I love the Abraham-Hicks
yeah,
work, and so I definitely don't want to discount it. It's incredibly valuable. And I was talking with a friend the other day about how, a lot of these practices maybe are just designed, just like a drug is, to get you to a certain level of perception so that you can then jump off into something else that wouldn't have been available to you if you hadn't taken that first rocket up, right?
yeah,
And so absolutely the Abraham-Hicks work has been that rocket for me. and
yeah,
and you know the way that I interpret it now is that if I can find alignment with misalignment, like basically comfort with discomfort,
mhm, yeah,
that allows me to be someone who can walk through lions dens. And
yeah,
the experience that I want to have is not one where I'm constantly pivoting away from things that seem too hard, but walking directly into them. And
yeah,
so for me, I'm having an aligned experience. I've found the language and the philosophy that allows me to align with something that's uncomfortable and then overcome it. And there's so much satisfaction in that's all I do now.
yeah.
But
And
there
that's
was
like a remapping. That's a remapping of pleasure for you, like that.
exactly.
It's a kind of a participation between your memory, your energetic memory, remembering the result of things, not just the upfront feeling of things, that kind of remap that as a pleasurable choice. Like
Yeah.
this pleasure to think, oh, I can't wait to see what's on the other side of this trapped energy, or I
And
can't.
so in many ways, I'm following the Abraham-Hicks work to a T because I found a way to find alignment with the thing that I wanted, right?
Yeah,
Which is to be able to walk into anything. And so
yeah,
you could say I'm still following that work. And the thing that I saw in that community was that I think a lot of times Abraham is speaking to the specific energy in the hot seat. And so based on where their energy is at, they give certain
yeah,
advice, but
yeah,
that advice doesn't necessarily have to map onto you because they might have said it a different way to you if you were in the hot seat. And so there's been plenty of therapists who have gone in and said, well, what about exploring the past? What about all the stuff we do as a therapist? And Abraham-Hicks has basically poo-pooed all of that, and probably rightfully so,
well,
because
I
I think that there
disagree.
are.
I don't think she said. I think it's a different. She hasn't said don't do that. I think she said if you want to do that, but maybe that it's not required so much. She will jump on a lot of people. She will jump on a lot of people in the hot seat, like you're saying. I've heard her tackle people when they have a kind of repetitive
You're correct
dragging.
that they never say don't do something.
Yeah,
They say, why would you do that?
yeah,
You know, I think that there are enough examples of probably what both of us are talking about of them presenting the concept of quote unquote shadow work in a way where you can find alignment with it, or you know, if that feels like the thing that you want to do, or just don't put your focus there. You know, but there, the way that that gets interpreted by the community maybe is more what I took issue with than what they're actually teaching. I think that there is a part of that community that interprets that as I can't look at anything uncomfortable. And
yeah,
as I'm an entrepreneurial consultant, so I work with a lot of entrepreneurs who were in that space of, no, I just don't want to look at the things that aren't working in my business. I'm just going to think about the way I want it to be.
yeah,
And that's not, at least I didn't find that to be an effective way of running a business, because it created this inflationary bubble on top of the business that if that person was ever not aligned, came crumbling down as a house of cards. And so then I would have sessions where we'd have to repair some of the things that should have been or could have been repaired in their subtle stages, but because they weren't, they ballooned in. And of course, that's what Abraham-Hicks is always saying. Well, if you don't tend to it, don't worry, it'll get bigger. And you know, that's the part that you know, as someone who has deep respect for that work, I really hope that people are understanding that there is value in looking at what's going wrong in your life, because that provides the contrasting springboard for the new desires. But putting your head in the sand and ignoring it, while Abraham-Hicks on some occasions will say that's the appropriate move, isn't always the appropriate move. It's only the appropriate move when it is. And that's the paradox of it.
Yeah. The bridge I've heard her make before, she talks about step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I think step 1, oh gosh, I can't remember if I repeat this, but step 1 is when you're sifting and sorting through reality and you encounter something that you don't like. And then the step 2 is, I think, figuring out what you do like and aligning with it. Mm-hmm. And step 3, I think, is a consistency where you can hold that consistent. And then step 4, I think, was when you start to enjoy the dips. You enjoy finding things you don't like about life.
Yes.
Because you realize
you know that's where the desire is coming from.
Yeah.
It's some, I think you if I'm remembering it correctly, it's something like that. It's you experience something you don't like, you ask, it's given, then you have to align with the fact that it's now been given. And then step 5 is you become comfortable with discomfort, because you know that it's bringing you back around, and you just ride that wheel around. And yeah, I mean, it absolutely works. And you know, maybe I'm just having my own interpretation of that work, but you know, that work is what launched me into my spiritual journey.
Yeah, and you grapple with it. I see you grapple with it online, which I enjoy, because I argue with most of my teachers. You know, like I learn their profound lesson and then I argue with them for the next 10 years about it, because I have to work through it. I have to make it mine.
Yeah, well, that's the fun of having a coach or a teacher, is like, it's someone that you can be wrong with, and they help give you a context for sharpening your own blade. And, you know, we see in Hollywood all the time that the student eventually becomes the teacher. And part of that is because of the dynamic of the relationship. The teacher is the blade sharpener, and at some point, that relationship allows for the blade to be so sharp that it can then cut its own path.
Amen. I really appreciate that. I had a teacher once tell me, because I think I was still in the phase where I'd had maybe 4 or 5 profound teachers in a row. Just profound. Like each teacher like put their hands on the giant wooden doors and flung them open, and I walked into a whole new Garden of Eden of understanding,
Yeah.
and magic and capability and power. And then at some point, one of my teachers was like, it's not, there's not going to be that many more teachers like this that just open the door for you. Like, you will be amongst teachers, all opening the door for each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit what you're talking about. Where
Yeah. Well, and then maybe the experience beyond having a teacher who just opens the door for you is having a teacher, like the guru relationships that you read about in the East, who is like hyper disciplined and making you sweep the floors of the ashram, and their job is to truly sharpen you. And so they trigger everything in you that isn't serving you in a way that forces you to release it and become more well integrated. And for me, the teaching experience that I had that triggered me the most was this guy, AJ Miller in Australia, who claims to be the reincarnation of Jesus. But he has a really interesting take on the spirit realms and reality and how we connect into love. And I disagreed with everything that he said until I came into alignment with it. And so it was such a different experience. With Abraham, I was like, oh, Abraham, I love you. This is so much fun. Like the Abraham-Hicks work was so fun, and it was that opening of the door, and it was infinite possibility. And then with the Divine Truth AJ Miller work, it was this interesting experience that I talked about, where I was vehemently repelled by what he was saying initially, and yet I could feel that it was important, and I kept going back to it. And as I felt through the hard, heavy feelings that I was having about the work, it began to resonate with me more than anything that I had come across. And it was a really interesting experience that opened me up to this idea of, oh, now that I've found alignment with what it is I want, there's an opportunity for me to find alignment with what I supposedly don't want, because there might be beautiful diamonds hidden in the pressure of all of that.
Yeah. I agree that, and that maybe someone like Jordan Peterson is in that camp too. He has a big thing of, your sometimes your biggest power comes from the places where you haven't taken responsibility, which is kind of that same, it's like looking under the dark sheet, for your next superpower.
I love Jordan Peterson, and I think he's such a powerful presenter of ideas, and I love to watch him grapple with ideas on stage. It's so interesting to see somebody at that level of intellect grapple with something. It's a really fascinating thing to watch, but also it's interesting to have the realization that he doesn't have it all figured out either. Nobody really does, and so you can grapple right along with him, and that's part of the fun of
it. One second. I think the internet became a little unstable for a second, so we got a lot of funny compressions. Am I looking?
I hear you now? I hear you now.
Okay, so say what you just said again, because I'd like to hear it.
So I was just saying that, Jordan Peterson is an amazing presenter from my mind, and the most fascinating thing about him is that he's still working it out. He doesn't have all the answers. And so it's so interesting to watch somebody with that level of intellect grapple with something in the moment on stage. And you can literally see the wheels in his brain and in his head turning.
He puts the math on the board.
As he's approaching those concepts. And so it's really fun to watch somebody who can be that intellectually honest about what they know and don't know, because it allows you to grapple in the experience with them. And so instead of him telling you what to think, he's teaching and modeling for you how you think. And that's what my experience with Jordan Peterson has been one of awe, because he taught me how to think more critically by modeling it for me.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Well, let's see. We've covered so much. I'm like, if I'm looking at the path that we've walked down, we've come many miles, it feels like.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed it. I appreciate you inspiring the conversation. You know, I think for me, maybe that concept of, you know, comfortably grappling with the fact that I don't know, you know, is the thing that sharpens the blade, perhaps, you know, because I'm not willing to concede that I know it all, then that always leaves enough friction that I'm constantly sharpening, or at least I hope I am. I feel like I'm having an experience of becoming more mentally energetic and emotionally acute. And right now, that's an incredibly satisfying experience. And certainly conversations like this, for me, I can feel that some of those concepts came into a little bit more clarity, and I was able to see them in a slightly higher resolution. And, you know, I appreciate someone who can hold the space for that. And I think that we both have a level of alignment with worldview, but enough difference where we both are walking away somewhat different than when we came in.
Yeah. Oh, it's been great. It's fun to see someone who's been on much the same journey, but in a different room of it. And you're like, oh, that's really cool how you put that together. I really like that. There were several little mind-popping moments that you gave me. It was great. It was
For sure. Well, we'll have to do it more regularly. If that ever resonates, I'm down, because I enjoyed it.
Good. Okay, good. Let's do it. I'm just trying to think of like everything we've covered. We've talked about substances. We've talked about intuition, choices, waterfalls. We've talked about levels of that intuition, or that you process at. We've talked about. Let's see. It's been a long journey.
Yeah. Tentacles coming out of your solar plexus so that you
Oh,
can
I love that
navigate
one.
a perfect waterfall jump.
I love that one. Have you ever seen the images of Barbara Brennan, where she describes, she was a NASA scientist who illustrated out everything that she saw psychically. And
No, I haven't, but that sounds interesting.
yeah, she has these diagrams of the chakras that look like, you know, medical diagrams, you know, and one of it, they would show a vortex at the chakra, and then inside that vortex were little vortexes that look like they all came out like octopus fingers. So, you know, but they would bundle in like a coaxial cable, you know, like as they come in, and then they would become a big vortex. So it's like all these little bits of information. Of course, like they say, one of the things Nassim Haramein put in my mind was not to think of the waveform as a 2D image, but actually as a 3D image, and probably a 5-dimension or, you know, multi-dimensional image of this corkscrew. And of course, we'd be attached out to all these different little information sources. The image I had for the show was a guy. I took a picture of a man who was jumping, and then took the magnetosphere of the planet and kind of put them like wings around that, you know, his body, as if we have that same kind of energetic looping tentacles that go out and feel the whole field around us.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you know, I'm experimenting with the idea of us living in some kind of a consciousness-based simulation, a la Tom Campbell, who's a physicist who wrote a book called My Big Toe, and it's his big theory of reality. And it's this idea that reality is information based, that we live inside of a consciousness computing system, and that we can have interaction with that system, right? Yeah. And that there's all these different information streams that we can bring in. And so the physical manifestation of those streams could be a lot of things based on your personal perception. It could be you could get information that just kind of comes as a matrix style download. Oh, I can fly a helicopter. Or it could be delivered to you as the visual manifestation of an angel whispering in your ear, or an alien, or tentacles going out to get it, or your chakras. What he's talking about is the visual representation of the information manifesting in your experience is part of your creation experience. You're creating the visual mechanism for delivery. The information can come to you in whatever form it needs to come to. To use Abraham-Hicks language, if the path of least resistance is that all the information that you're looking for is in a book, then maybe you just find the book at Barnes & Noble. But if you're looking to have a more cosmic experience, then maybe you start to channel, the Galactic Federation of such and such, and all of a sudden you're getting information through the visual and mental construct of this federation. But really, it's just information that could take whatever form your belief system wants to package it. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's cool about this choose your own adventure reality that we live in, is that, what she interprets as these tentacle-like things and these chakras with these different naughty points that are collecting information and bringing it back into your system, I could interpret as, an alien abducting me and implanting me with it. And whatever my belief system and visual construct wants to be or needs to be in order to move me in the evolutionary direction that maybe at some higher level I want to go, that's the way that the information will manifest. And that's why I like to look in all the nooks and crannies of everything, because when you're open to everything, you create that non-resistance for information to find you in really interesting ways. And when somebody is completely adverse to all the conspiracy theory stuff, and that there's beings that are channeling extra dimensional beings, or that you can connect with your future self, or that there's aliens and the spaceships are getting closer and closer, all of this stuff doesn't necessarily have to literally be happening. It can just be a representation of some kind of energy construct that's happening. And that just happens to be the way that I'm most suited in this moment to receive that information.
Yeah. I've had a number of thinkers along that line that I've read. I think Dion Fortune, she was a famous occultist, turn of the century. And she described deity as this kind of merging between the unknowable energies of the universe and the interface that our brains can work with. And that where deity was born was where these two things melded, where we almost like we created a mental funnel for this cosmic unknowable energy to fit itself into and animate. And we allow it to be unknowable. We allow it to do weird things that we'd never expect, that our egos don't expect. Yeah. And I can appreciate that creativity, because it's almost like, Facebook, when you interface with Facebook, everyone's Facebook looks the same colors. But remember the days of MySpace where people had all kinds of crazy colors? And it's you could design your spiritual life, the background paper, what your deity's going to look like. Is she like some princess from the stars, or is she, just a squiggle on a wall?
Right. Yeah. And the interesting thing, one of the things I'm grappling with right now is it's that, and it's also not that. Like, you can have that experience of designing it however you want it, but then the experience that I'm having right now is you can also have the experience of it being separate from you and it being designed by something else. And so right now I'm experimenting with the concept of God being an entity outside of myself that has a higher perspective and that is tuned into that perfect frequency of love and modeling that for me, and then I can tune into that. And so it's like most of my life I was constructing my own version of that entity, and now I'm experimenting with, well, I wonder if that entity is already designed and it wants to show up as something different than what I am, which allows it to be more than what I currently am. And so I'm having a really interesting experience of feeling through the uncomfort of that entity being unknown to me. And those are both valid experiences, I think.
Yeah, I love that, because I think a lot of us grew up with Christianity, and that was a little bit more of the model.
Yes.
And then this current generation has definitely had a lot of experimentation out of that model, trying to see, like the New Age movement, or trying to see God not as separate, but as internal as well. And I don't know that they're necessarily not the same concept. You know, like for the question that I ask when you say that is, okay, well, how then? Where do you hear God? You know, like where is it? What you see happen in the field around you? Is it what comes up inside you? Like, what's the interface with God for you in that model?
It's an emotional interface, is at least what I'm experimenting with. It is it's a kind of I guess innate wisdom is the word for it. It's a feeling, but it's not a feeling that I've ever had before until I started experimenting with this kind of interface. And it is that feeling that I'm talking about of you don't want to look at this, but it's important. You know, it's that feeling. And it's hard to describe that feeling because until pretty recently, I had never had that feeling. Like the feeling was no or yes. Like there wasn't a middle ground on that. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a no, but it should be a yes. And so maybe it's just a different level of subtlety. You know, maybe as we learn to feel into more subtle energy, maybe we're more capable of interfacing with something that that isn't wholly designed by us. You know, maybe apotheosis isn't the goal. Maybe we aren't God, but are rather children of God. And maybe apotheosis is the goal, and we are God. But everybody's on the apotheosis we're God route right now, and so I'm experimenting with, like you said, like what was it about my Christian roots that were valuable, and what kind of distortions existed in that world that, if removed, would make that system beautiful. And so, you know, it's experimentation. I have a deep level of curiosity for how things work and why I interface with things the way that I do. And so it seemed a disservice to not revisit some of those concepts. And you know, to the credit of A.J. Miller and his teaching Divine Truth, he's intellectually opened me up to some processes that have allowed me to have this deeper emotional experience, you know, and now I'm running it as an experiment. I had a vivid experience on the I am God, we are all gods apotheosis journey. Like I had a very fun experience on that essentially occult version of control. And now I'm having a really fun and beautiful experience in the releasing of control and allowing things to happen to me and letting reality hit me right in the nervous system and feeling through whatever that feeling is. And again, maybe the place that I end up is some merging of that. But right now, I'm leaning a little bit more this way because I already lean pretty far this way.
Yes. This is one of my favorite, I live near where Aristotle used to live. And so, of course, I had to investigate him. And one of my favorite things that he talked about was the old Greek idea of nothing in extreme. But his version of it was more that we're always sliding between too much of something and too little of something. You know, and that it's important to honor both ends of that polarity and then find the right place that feels like the right place to be in that moment.
Yeah. Well,
like sometimes
it's like when you start to learn how to bowl, you put the bumpers in there, and and the reason is because you need to get familiar with where those edges are, and then you slowly remove the bumpers, and you're able to find that middle ground and hit that strike more often. But the bumpers are appropriate information to learn early on, so you can't know where the middle is unless you know where the edges are, right?
Yeah. So I think I'm a little bit of a contrarian. I'm not going to call you a contrarianist, but I am sometimes. Like I find myself naturally being contra the dominant, you know, orthodoxy, whatever it is. And the moment everyone agrees with me, that I'm done.
I'm wholeheartedly a contrarian. Even if I believe something to my core, if I can tell that somebody else believes it too much, I'll argue with them.
Yes, me too.
And that's fun because as a mode of thinking, that is that way that we sharpen each other, is by calling each other on, you know, speaking your truth into the room, I think is the most effective way to up-level the room. And even if that truth is uncomfortable, I do think that there's some mechanism of reality that wouldn't have put that room together in the way that it did, and created the circumstances where that truth could be spoken if that truth didn't need to be heard by the room. And so sometimes that truth needs to be spoken because after you speak it, the guilt that you feel showcases to you that that wasn't actually the truth. And sometimes that truth needs to be spoken because somebody else needed to hear it. And either way, if you don't speak it, you won't know.
Yeah. And when people speak their truth with each other, I think some forms of healing can only take place when you take that thought in your head and you put it out there and you expose it to the sunlight of other people's perception. And sometimes that other people's perception can be a misguiding thing, but it can also be the thing that sharpens, like you said, it sharpens your own perception. And I think we're built to do that. You can see that communities are built, especially in Greece, where people are more likely to tell you what you need to do a little bit. Like they're like, you should do this, you need to do that. And I feel like in my Southern upbringing, the women were very much like that was around, like, you should change your shirt, or you should da-da-da-da, you know. And there's that kind of communal, probably built-in instinct to help a person see themselves and move towards a more successful life pattern, or at least what that community thinks is a successful life pattern.
Yeah.
It can be a helpful thing sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that's why in this country, the First Amendment is so powerful, and why we need to make sure that we're standing up for free speech and grappling with what that actually means. Because, you know, in the current technological age, there are some factions of the conversation that are getting shut down through censorship, and I don't know that that is the best way to counter those ideas. You know, having an open dialogue with someone and pressing them on their ideas and their motivations and their intentions, to me, seems more productive than just shutting the conversation down. Because when you shut the conversation down, everybody that is pro that conversation says, see, I told you it was the truth. They wouldn't have shut it down if it wasn't the truth. And everybody that was against that conversation says, good, we're right. We can only have conversations that are right. But again, it's about finding that middle meld point that we're talking about. And you can't have that unless you're properly exposed to ideas that run counter to your own. And then pressed on ideas that don't hold up to reality.
Yeah. It's nice when it's nice when you feel that you can weather that polishing or that buffing you get.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing about the internet is that there is a large segment of the population that is afraid to post what they really think because they're afraid of the backlash. And
Yeah.
I'm in a latter stage of this where I don't have a lot of fear, but on some subjects I still do have some fear about talking about it. I used to have a ton of fear, and I wouldn't post any of my real thoughts. I would post the things that I knew were going to get me the positive feedback that I wanted. And part of that getting comfortable with discomfort allowed me to start expressing myself for who I really am in this moment. And then the feedback that I got would hit me in the nervous system and show me what I still needed to feel. And as people flooded in and commented and told me that I was an idiot or that my ideas weren't valid, some of them were just mean, but I needed to feel through the feeling, the uncomfortable resistance that I had towards getting feedback like that, to now, if somebody leaves me feedback like that, it just doesn't bother me. But Bashar used to say, channeled by Daryl Donka, he used to say, if you're wearing a red sweatshirt and somebody runs up to you and says, your blue sweatshirt is so stupid, you don't go, well, that really hurt my feelings. You go, well, my sweatshirt isn't blue, it's red. You're a crazy person, and it doesn't have an emotional impact on you. And that's the experience that I have when somebody comes to me with and gives me negative feedback on an idea that I feel I've properly felt my way through and that I've effectively grappled with. If I have done the deep work to grapple with something at that level and somebody gives me negative feedback, it doesn't have an emotional impact on me. But if it does, I know that I'm not done with grappling with that idea. And so it's incredibly valuable feedback for me, because if somebody comes in and says, that part's stupid, you didn't think about that, and it triggers me emotionally, I know that I'm not in the balanced perspective that I want to be on that idea. And so that's also valuable input. But if I didn't share that idea and then let the feedback hit me in my nervous system, I wouldn't be able to effectively continue to sharpen the blade on that particular subject.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. It's a real medicine for the times, I think. It's definitely my edge as well. I feel that same edge. And I can feel parts of my reality being ready to be expressed and talked about. And then other parts, it's almost like watching a flower bloom a little bit. Like it opens somewhat in the right timing, the right amount of sunlight, you could feel the time, people being more prepared to hear different things, people ready to grapple with things. What's that?
I said, right. I mean, that sounds right to me. And, for me, I do a lot of personal grappling before I express myself, because I'm someone who cares about how I'm perceived. And I'm not 100% sure that that's a good thing to care about. But it's one of those things where when my brother and I used to go to film festivals and we would look at films, you would see some directors who had created an absolutely terrible film, and they were so egotistically absorbed with themselves and thought that they had created something great, and they couldn't hear any of the feedback, and so then next year they'd have another film and it would be just as bad. They weren't ever getting better in their craft because they weren't willing to accept and integrate hard feedback. But the directors and the artists at those film festivals who would put something out and then take all of the criticism and feedback and properly integrate it, the next year their film would be light years better, and then the film next year would be light years better, because that grappling with that feedback is what makes you better at the thing that you're doing, whether that's thinking or creating or being an artist or being an entrepreneur. And so anytime I think that I'm really confident about an idea, the next step is to write something about it and put it out there, or do a Facebook Live about it. And I'll immediately know if I'm actually as confident as I thought I was about that idea. And that's good feedback to have. And if you keep to yourself and just say, that's not my problem, I don't want to post something because I don't want to be seen like an idiot, well, you're always going to be in that uncomfortable place of feeling like somebody might think you're an idiot. And until you feel through that feeling where that doesn't matter anymore, at least my experience has been, it's not as satisfying to hold back on that. And one of the things that I'm going to be doing more and more is putting myself out there a little bit more. So I've gotten pretty good at articulating my thoughts in the written form, and I want to graduate that up into the video form. And this is an interesting way to be doing is this conversation that you and I are having, because there's a difference between being able to carefully craft your words in writing versus having to come up with them in the moment. And I definitely want to be someone who can do that. And I think writing does make you a better conversationalist, but having conversations is what really makes you a better conversationalist. And that means that you have to be vulnerable enough to put yourself out there and then get feedback that may be uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think sometimes in the work that I work with people, there's a level of needing to unplug from other people's perception of you in order to hear your own personal vibration, your own personal feedback. But then there's a level of reconnecting to the outside world because I think it's a circuit. It's a level of circuit that our mind works on. It's a level of the way that we're built. We're meant to be circuited in, looped in through social behavior. Yeah. And so being successful in a social environment means having to connect to that circuit and work it and have all those voices coming at you. And that's the way we're designed to learn too. But it's a balance. It's a balance when you have those two things and you can move back and forth between them. Then I think also if you have a mindset, I think that people who have a God concept can feel this a little bit more. If you can feel that there's a soul talking behind someone, behind the ego, and you can kind of do the math to get below the ego and hear maybe their full being, then even if someone says something in a really cranky, spit in your face kind of way, you can still hear sometimes the echoes of what their soul is actually trying to help you with. You can feel the love coming through at that level, even though, the ego pokes you in the head.
Right. Yeah. Someone can have good intentions, but bad execution.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you understand intentions and you can understand the way most egos work, or your understanding of the ego gets more and more a more complete map, then it's much easier to do the backwards math. You can decipher so much faster. And also I think there's more, there's an energetic layer coming through too. Like that channel is available. I see a lot of psychics work this way, where they're like, well, I'm talking to their ego self, and this is what their higher self is saying. Like, it's just another channel you can hop on to hear.
I think that's right. It's like these layers of the facade onion, and you can interact with each layer of that onion, but eventually you get into kind of the core of it, and ultimately that's where that place, I think, of deep empathy comes from, is when you've peeled back all of those layers, there's just a rawness to your being that when it no longer feels like it has to protect itself, can truly present authentically.
Yeah.
And everybody has that, and everybody is at their own desired or level of awareness in peeling back that onion. And I think that what I have attempted to do as a coach, and what it feels to me that you're good at doing, is holding space for that onion to, or those layers of the onion to peel back naturally, because sometimes all it takes is to see that part that you're talking about, to see the real them, and just having been seen for who I really am melts away some of those facades.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed the work of Paul Selig, who kind of works in a Christ consciousness realm, we could say, and some of his work really teaches about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to many of his workshops, and it is so interesting. I would say that he's one of the best psychics on the planet. To me, he gets more accurate information than any other psychic that I've seen. And being in a workshop with him is so powerful, because one, his guides energetically just pump the room. I mean, your hair is standing on edge. But two, one of the modalities that he uses is speaking to people's higher self, right? Which is kind of their authentic self, what we're talking about. But also he can channel, your parents' higher self and communicate their higher self to you. And and the effect that has in workshop is palpable. I mean, people have transformational experiences. And Paul is an incredibly theatrical man, and so he's able to embody the presence of these things, where people are like, "That's my dad. You just did my dad."
Has he ever done you?
Yeah.
Has he ever done you?
The one time that he did me, his guides told me that I was seen in the spirit realms as this prankster jokester, and then I was just constantly walking around with my tongue out going, ah! And I was like, yeah, okay, I can see that. And metaphorically, what that represented to me was, I want to taste life. Like, I'm not interested in having a casual experience with life. I want to put it in my mouth. And that he I think has a way of theatrically bringing in themes that are incredibly valuable to people wherever they're at.
Wonderful. Well, now it feels like this is the end of the trailhead, I think. At least
cool.
I'm going to stop recording, and
okay.
Thank you so much for coming and talking too. This has been great. I mentioned I first encountered you from my sister's girlfriend.
Okay.
And
I met her at a Paul Selig workshop.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so funny. That's great. Okay, that's great. Yeah, and I've been reading you for a while, so it's just nice to actually have a conversation with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you one, hosting the conversation, but just your perspective and your ability to hear and integrate and ask questions and be a good mirror. Like, that's what it felt like. I felt like I was seen by you, and that you were a really effective mirror, and that's valuable because it shows me what that looks like, and that's what I want to be that for other people as well.
Oh, good. Well, I trust in your mirroring ability for sure. There's a good flow that comes from you. Like you're effective at dimensioning out your thoughts so that other people can see them tacked up on the wall.
Thank you.
In a readable format. Go ahead.
Cool. Well, yeah, I would love to do this on a regular basis. I really did enjoy it. And whether we record it or not, we should definitely continue to connect at this level, because I found it to be incredibly valuable. And,
Good.
you know, I mean, anytime you record a conversation, it's hard to know, was that just valuable to the two people in the conversation, or was there something in there that other people are going to find value from? And I hope that that's the case, but even if it wasn't, you know, maybe this can inspire other people to have conversations with people across the globe that can help them sharpen their own thoughts and their own thinking around reality.
I hope all that stuff happens. I definitely learned plenty. I'm going to look forward to going back and watching this and digesting things at another level when I'm not thinking just about holding the conversation, but I can just sink into the information too. So I'm looking forward to that.
Cool, man. Well, right. I'll let you get back to your, I guess it's your evening and it's my day. So I'm going to go and see what this beautiful, clear Texas sky looks like out there. Maybe get a vitamin D power up, and we'll connect whenever we connect again.
Good. I'm just coming at the end of that. Let me tell you, today is marvelous. I've already had my today, but you're about to have your today. It was
You're
beautiful.
in the future.
I'm in the future. It was a marvelous day. it just ended. I'm already in the next day. See, it's 12:11. See, I'm already in tomorrow.
Tomorrow's gonna be great too.
I'm calling to you from tomorrow.
I love that. Well, thank you for being my voice from the future, and I appreciate the forewarning that it's going to be great.
All right, enjoy yourself. I'm just going to stop recording, and then